The story of Eden was written down in clay 1,000 years before anyone in Israel put a word on paper. I don't mean something similar to it. I don't mean a story with a few overlapping themes. I mean the specific structure, the darkness before light, the separation of waters, the garden, the test, the food you should not eat, the consequence that falls on everyone who comes after. The bones of Genesis 2 and 3 were carved into Mesopotamian clay tablets, while the ancestors of the biblical writers were still herding sheep in a land those Babylonian scribes would never have visited. And when I finally understood that, really understood it, not as an abstract claim but as a documented, datable linguistic fact, it changed the way I read every page of what I thought I knew. Let me tell you how I got there. It started with a single word I couldn't explain. I had been working through Genesis 1 one winter evening, the way I do sometimes, slowly with a concordance and a couple of commentaries open beside me on the desk. It was late, the kind of quiet where you can hear the heat clicking on in the house, the lamp throwing a cone of yellow light across the papers. Outside the window the trees were bare and the street was empty. I had been reading the first 2 verses for probably the 30th time in my life. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. I stopped at the phrase, the deep. In Hebrew, the word is tehom. I had read it dozens of times without thinking carefully about it. But that night, I had been reading something else alongside it, a translation of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which I had pulled from an interlibrary loan copy of Stephanie Dalley's Myths from Mesopotamia. I had requested it through the county library system 3 weeks earlier. The librarian who called to say it had arrived sounded slightly puzzled about what a retired history teacher from Knoxville needed with a translation of ancient Mesopotamian mythology. I didn't explain. Some threads you don't explain until you know where they lead. The name that kept appearing in that ancient Babylonian text was Tiamat. Tiamat, the primordial sea monster, the chaos dragon, the being that the god Marduk defeats to create the world. I looked at the 2 words, Tiamat, tehom. I knew enough about Semitic linguistics to know that these were not 2 separate words that happened to sound alike. These were the same root, the same ancient Proto-Semitic word for the deep, the abyss, the primordial ocean, carried in 2 different directions across 2 different languages and 2 different cultures. The author of Genesis 1 was not inventing new vocabulary. He was using a word so old it predated Israel, predated Moses, predated the entire story of the Hebrew people as a nation. He was using the name of the Babylonian chaos monster, hebraicized, stripped of its mythological identity, repurposed into a common noun. The God of the Bible created the world using the vocabulary of the Babylonian chaos dragon. I sat with that for a long time that night, long enough for the coffee to go cold. The Dalley translation and the concordance opened side by side on the desk, like 2 witnesses, and then I started pulling on the thread. The first person in modern history to pull on that thread publicly was a man named George Smith, and when he finally showed the world what he had found, 2 of the most powerful men in England were sitting in the same room watching his hands shake. George Smith was not a scholar. He had never attended a university. He was a banknote engraver by trade, a man who had taught himself cuneiform by spending his lunch breaks in the reading rooms of the British Museum, hunching over glass cases of clay tablets, teaching himself to read a script that had been dead for 2,000 years. The museum eventually hired him as an assistant. And then one day in the autumn of 1872, while sorting through a crate of fragmented tablets from the excavations at Nineveh, he found a piece of clay with a story on it he recognized. The tablet was catalogued as K63. It is now known as Tablet Ips of the Epic of Gilgamesh. On that tablet, Smith read the story of a man warned by a god to build a boat, to take aboard the creatures of the earth, to ride out a flood that would destroy everything, to release a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, to find land, to make offerings when the water receded, to be rewarded with something approaching immortality. He read the story of Noah, except it had been written in Babylon, and it was older than the biblical account by centuries. George Smith is said to have jumped up from his workbench, run around the room and begun removing his jacket. Whether that detail is exactly true, I cannot tell you, but it has the ring of a man whose hands could not hold still. On December 3rd, 1872, Smith stood before the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London to present his discovery. The room that evening held two men whose presence alone tells you what was at stake: William Ewart Gladstone, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Archibald Campbell Tate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leader of the government and the leader of the Church of England, both seated in the same hall, watching a self-taught banknote engraver hold up a clay tablet and say calmly that the flood story did not originate with Moses. I think about that room sometimes, what the silence must have sounded like. Gladstone watching, the Archbishop watching, the careful, deliberate stillness of men in power confronting a fact they have no institutional mechanism to absorb. What happened next is almost as strange. The proprietor of the Daily Telegraph, a man named Edwin Arnold, was so alarmed, or perhaps so excited, by the implications of Smith's find that he personally funded a new excavation at Nineveh, specifically to look for more fragments. A newspaper paid for an archaeological dig in the Iraqi desert because a biblical story turned out to have a Babylonian predecessor. That tells you something about what the discovery meant and what the stakes felt like in 1872. Smith went to Nineveh. He found more fragments. He died in Syria at 36 years old from dysentery before he had finished his work. The tablets he found are still in the British Museum. You can look at photographs of K63 online right now, today, from wherever you are sitting. The cuneiform is still legible. What Smith had found was the end of a thread. The thread itself was much older. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, was composed somewhere between 1100 and 1700 years before the Common Era, depending on which scholar you follow. The text as we have it dates to around 1100 BCE, but the traditions it preserves are older still, and what it describes in its opening tablets is the sequence by which the world was made. Here is that sequence: primordial darkness and chaos, the mingling of the freshwater deep and the saltwater ocean, the first gods emerging from that mixture, conflict among the divine beings, the god Marduk defeating the chaos monster Tiamat. And then, this is the part that stopped my breath when I read it carefully, Marduk takes Tiamat's body and cuts it in half. Half of her body becomes the sky, half becomes the earth. The waters above are held in place. The waters below are separated from the dry land. Then Marduk creates the luminaries, the moon, the sun, the stars. Then he creates human beings. Now let me give you the sequence from Genesis chapter 1. Darkness over the face of the deep, the Spirit hovering over the waters. God separates the light from the darkness. God separates the waters above from the waters below, creating a firmament. God separates the water below from the dry land. God creates the sun, the moon, the stars. God creates human beings. Darkness, separation of waters, firmament, dry land, luminaries, humans. Darkness, separation of waters, firmament, dry land, luminaries, humans. The sequence is not similar. The sequence is identical. Now here is the part I need you to hold on to, sir, because this is where it gets theologically serious. In the Enuma Elish, human beings are created from the blood of a rebel god as a punishment to serve the divine bureaucracy and relieve the other gods of menial labor. They are servants, created to do the work the gods didn't want to do. You exist so the gods don't have to dig their own irrigation canals. That is what the Babylonian story says you are. In Genesis, a single God, alone, deliberately, carefully, creates human beings in his own image. B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, not servants, not afterthoughts, image bearers. The entire moral and legal architecture of biblical ethics, human dignity, the prohibition of murder, the concept of inherent worth, rests on those three Hebrew words. Same structure, completely opposite message about what human beings are. That transformation is real. It is radical. But you can only see how radical it is when you know what it was built on top of. And tehom, the deep, is still there. Right there in Genesis 1:2. The ghost of Tiamat, preserved in plain sight in the first paragraph of the Bible. The word didn't disappear. It was just quietly stripped of its mythology and kept, because it was the only word that existed for what it was trying to describe. The ancient vocabulary outlasted the ancient theology. The name stayed. The monster was gone. The flood story was not the only parallel that Smith's discovery opened. Once scholars began reading the rest of the cuneiform library, from Nineveh, from Nippur, from Sippar, the depth of the overlap became impossible to dismiss. The myth of Adapa dates to approximately 1400 years before the Common Era. Adapa is a man of great wisdom, perhaps a priest, perhaps a royal sage. He is summoned before the god Anu in the heavens, and there, in the divine court, he is offered something, food and drink, the food and drink of the gods, the thing that would confer immortality on any who consumed it. He refuses. He has been warned by the god Ea not to eat or drink what is offered. The warning was meant to protect him, but the warning was wrong or incomplete, or a test he was not supposed to pass. By refusing the food of immortality, Adapa loses the chance at eternal life. Not just for himself, the consequence falls on humanity as a whole. Adapa's failure at the divine table is why human beings die. A man in the presence of a god offered something he should or should not consume. He fails the test. He loses immortality. His failure becomes the inheritance of everyone who comes after him. You know that story. You were told it was unique to Israel. You were told it was the story of Adam. Then there is the Atrahasis Epic, dated to approximately 1650 years before the Common Era, composed during the reign of a Babylonian king named Ammi-Saduqa. The Atrahasis is remarkable for a specific structural reason. It contains both a creation account and a flood narrative within a single continuous text. Not two separate stories that had to be connected by later editors, but a unified narrative that moves from the making of the world to its near destruction by flood and the survival of one righteous man. Genesis chapters 2 through 9 does the same thing. Creation, then fall, then the long genealogies, then the flood, then the new beginning with Noah. That parallel is structural, not just a shared story, a shared architecture. The same movement from creation to catastrophe to survival, organized around the same bones. Stephanie Daly at Oxford, who has spent her career translating these texts, is careful to say that influence does not mean plagiarism. Cultures share stories. Traditions travel with trade routes. The question is never simply, did they copy? The more interesting question is what they did with what they inherited. And what the biblical authors did was strip the divine warfare, remove the cosmic politics, and replace a pantheon of feuding gods with a single creator who acts alone, out of will and purpose, and declares what he makes to be good. But the question of whether this happened at all, that is no longer a question. That was settled in a room in London in December of 1872, with the Prime Minister and the Archbishop watching a banknote engraver hold up ancient clay. Now I want to tell you about an afternoon that brought everything into focus. I had been working with two books open on my desk for weeks. On the left, Alexander Heidel's Babylonian Genesis, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1942, a careful column-by-column comparison of the Enuma Elish and Genesis 1, laid out side by side on facing pages. On the right, Richard Elliott Friedman's Who Wrote the Bible, the lamp on, the afternoon gone grey outside, the coffee gone cold again, which is a habit I've never managed to correct. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just reading slowly, moving between the two columns Heidel had laid out, the Enuma Elish on one side, Genesis on the other. And then I saw the pattern that Friedman had identified in the Genesis 1 text, sitting directly on top of the Enuma Elish sequence. In Genesis 1, there is a repetitive literary formula. Scholars call the source that wrote it the priestly source, or P. The pattern runs like this: "And God said, and it was so, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day." The same grammatical structure 6 times in a row. Methodical, architectural, almost liturgical. Friedman had argued that this priestly source, P, was composed or compiled late, after the Babylonian exile. After 5 decades of Israelite scribes and priests living in Babylon itself, in the same city where the Enuma Elish was a standard temple text, read aloud at the Babylonian New Year festival every single year. These were not scribes who had heard about Babylonian mythology from a distance. They were scribes who had lived inside it. And sitting there with both books open, I could see it. The six-stage sequence of the Enuma Elish feeding into the structure of P. Not the theology. The theology was the transformation. But the skeleton. The architectural sequence. Darkness to light. Waters separated firmament, land, luminaries, humanity. 6 stages presented in order, each one closed with a formal declaration before the next begins. It wasn't a eureka moment. It was more like a key turning in a lock that had been stiff for years. The mechanism finally releasing, everything settling into the position it had been designed for all along. I sat there for a while with both books open and the house quiet, and I thought, the exile was not just a tragedy, it was a library, and the scribes who lived through it came home carrying what they had read. This is where I need to introduce you to a man who understood all of this without any of the archaeology, without any of the cuneiform, without any excavation in Nineveh. He understood it by doing something the institutions of his time considered dangerous. He read the text carefully. Baruch Spinoza published his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus in 1670. He published it anonymously in Amsterdam because he knew what would happen if his name was on it. He had already been placed under a cherem, a formal excommunication, by the Amsterdam Jewish community 14 years earlier in 1656. The cherem document reads, "Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up." 4 cubits, roughly 6 feet, the distance everyone was required to maintain from him. It is the most severe excommunication document that survives from that period. Whatever the Amsterdam rabbis saw in the 23-year-old Spinoza, it terrified them. In chapters 9 and 10 of the Tractatus, Spinoza does something that had not been done in print before in quite this way. He argues from textual evidence alone that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, the book supposedly written by Moses, could not have been written by Moses. The internal evidence was too contradictory. The vocabulary shifted between sections. The style shifted. The theological emphases were inconsistent in ways that demanded separate authors working in separate historical moments. Spinoza proposed that Esdras, had compiled these texts from multiple sources into something approaching a unified text during the period of the return from Babylon. He was writing in 1670. I want you to hold those numbers in your mind. Cuneiform script was not deciphered until 1857, 187 years after Spinoza published his argument. The Enuma Elish was not presented to the public until George Smith's lecture in 1872, 202 years after the Tractatus. The Atrahasis Epic, the Adapa myth, the full weight of the Mesopotamian textual archive, none of it was available to Spinoza. He had no clay tablets. He had no excavation reports. He had no knowledge that an entire parallel literary tradition existed underneath the text he was reading. He had only the text, and from the text alone, from the inconsistencies in vocabulary, from the shifts in the name of God between chapters, from the structural repetitions that indicated different authorial hands, from the historical details that could not have been written by someone alive at the time the books claimed to describe, Spinoza concluded, this was a compiled text. Multiple authors, multiple historical moments, assembled by editors working in a specific institutional context. 202 years later, the archaeology confirmed exactly what he had said. What the exile produced, contact with Babylonian literary tradition, the encounter between Israelite scribes and the great cosmological epics of Mesopotamia, left traces in the text that Spinoza could read without knowing what had caused them. He saw the fingerprints without knowing who had left them. The archaeology gave us the names. That is what rigorous reading looks like, not the comfort of the tradition. The actual evidence in the text followed where it leads. I want to be precise about what this means and what it doesn't mean, because this is the part where I have seen people go in 2 wrong directions. The first wrong direction is to say that because Genesis shares structure and vocabulary with Babylonian texts, It is therefore worthless or derivative or nothing more than a copy with different names. That is not what the evidence shows. In the Enuma Elish, creation is the byproduct of divine warfare. The world exists because a god got angry, fought a monster, and used the corpse to make real estate. Human beings exist because the gods needed someone to dig irrigation canals. You were made to labor so that gods could rest. That is the story the dominant culture of the ancient Near East was telling about what you are. In Genesis 1, there is no warfare. There is no monster to defeat. There is no cosmic politics. There is one God, alone, speaking. And what he creates, he calls good. And the human beings he creates are not laborers to be managed. They are image bearers, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. That shift, that transformation, is the most radical theological move in the ancient Near East. You cannot fully see how radical it is unless you know the context it was written against. The Babylonian priests who recited the Enuma Elish at the New Year festival every year were telling their people, "You exist to serve. You were made from the blood of a rebel. Your value is your labor." The Israelite priests who compiled Genesis 1 were telling their people something entirely different, something that would take 2,500 years to fully work out its implications about human dignity, about the grounds of ethics, about why any single human life matters. Same skeleton, opposite soul. And here is the piece that the institution has always struggled with. Acknowledging the influence does not diminish the transformation. If anything, it makes the transformation more impressive. You cannot see what was done to this material unless you know what the material was before it was touched. The problem has never been the influence. The problem is when the institution insists there was no influence, when Sunday school teaches a story as if it fell from heaven fully formed, with no predecessors, no context, no cultural conversation. When acknowledging the Babylonian background is treated as an attack on the faith rather than a deeper and more honest reading of it. That is what Spinoza was fighting in 1670, not the text itself. The pretense that the text had no history. Let me bring this back to where it started. I began this with a word, tehom, that I couldn't explain on a winter evening with a concordance open beside me. That was the thread. Just one word that didn't quite fit the picture I had been carrying for 50 years. What I found when I pulled the thread was not a Bible stolen from somewhere else. What I found was something more interesting. The Eden story, the creation account, the test in the garden and its consequences. These were the product of a people in conversation with the world they lived in. Scribes in Babylon, surrounded by tablets describing the creation of the world and the nature of human beings, encountering those stories and producing something that transformed the material so completely that the transformation can look like creation from the outside. It looks like creation, but it is also inheritance. Richard Elliott Friedman puts it this way: the question is not who wrote the Bible. The question is what the people who wrote it were doing. What problem were they solving? What world were they living in? The priests who wrote Genesis 1 were in Babylon, surrounded by a story that said, "You are servants, you were made from the blood of a rebel. The universe was born out of violence." And they sat down and wrote, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and he saw that it was good." They took the sequence. They kept the word for the primordial deep. They discarded the violence and the theology of servitude, and they built something new on the old foundation. The Eden story wasn't stolen, it was transformed. But you can only see that transformation when you know what came before it. That's what 40 years of Sunday school never told me. Not because the people teaching it were dishonest, most of them were not, but because they had been taught to teach the story as if it had no ancestors, as if the word tehom was just a word, and had always been just a word. It wasn't just a word. It was the name of the chaos dragon, hebraicized, absorbed, transformed. The chaos monster became the abyss. The divine warfare became an act of deliberate, peaceful creation. The servants became image bearers. I find that more moving now than the version I was taught as a child, because now I can see what it cost to look at the dominant story of your cultural world and say, we are going to keep the structure and discard the soul of it and replace it with something that has never been said before about what a human being is worth. That is what happened between 597 and 539 before the Common Era. That is what Spinoza identified in 1670. That is what the tablets in the British Museum confirmed in 1872. The story was always bigger than they told us. If you made it this far, I want to ask you something. Not about the archaeology, not about the textual criticism, something simpler. When you were taught the Eden story, and you were taught it, most of you, in some form at some point, were you ever told it had neighbors? That it was in conversation with something older? That the word for the primordial ocean in Genesis 1:2 was the hebraicized name of a Babylonian sea monster who predated the entire story of Israel? If the answer is no, I'd like to know. Leave it in the comments, not to score a point against anyone. I genuinely want to know how many people got through their entire religious education without being told that the text had a history, that the writers of Genesis were human beings living in a specific time and place, inheriting a specific literary world and making deliberate choices about what to keep and what to change. Because here is what I believe after 12 years of reading outside the walls of the tradition I was raised in. The text is more interesting when you know its history. The transformation is more impressive when you can see what was transformed. The theological choices of the priestly writers become visible as choices, deliberate, radical, courageous choices, only when you know the alternative they rejected. The Sunday school version gives you a story. The full version gives you a civilization in the process of defining itself, reaching into the greatest literary tradition of its world, and deciding to say something completely different about what human beings are and what they are worth. I'd rather have the full version. Write truth in the comments if this changed how you see it. I read all of them. Take care of yourselves.